There is always an area in your application that you want to protect. Actions that you don't want any random user on the internet to be performing, and data that you don't want to expose. And for that reason, you will need to be able to identify the user that is using your application in order for you to decide if that user should get access to this action or this data or not. And in web applications, there are mainly two ways to achieve that. First, using session-based authentication, and second, using token-based authentication. In session-based authentication, we generate a session ID for each and every user that visits our application. And we store this session ID in a cookie inside the user browser. So each time the user sends a request to our application from the browser, we will get this session ID from the cookie, we will get the session cookie, and we will be able to extract the session ID. To authenticate a user, we will ask them to enter their email address and password, and we match these credentials with records in our database, and if they match correctly, we are going to store the user ID that's stored in the database inside the session data. And that's how we associate a session ID coming from a cookie that's stored in the user browser with a user stored in our database. In token-based authentication, instead of generating a session ID, we generate a token once the user enters their email or username and password, and we match it with a record in our database. We generate a token and share it with the user. The user will have to store this token somewhere in the browser, maybe in the local storage of the browser or inside a cookie or whatever. They handle storing this token, and they send it with each and every request going forward. So in session-based authentication, they don't send anything, the browser will send the cookie automatically, but in token-based authentication, they will have to send the token with each and every single request they send to our application. Typically, session-based authentication is more secure when it comes to HTML front ends, but Laravel ships with mechanisms to authenticate users using session-based authentication and token-based authentication as well. In this lesson, we will focus on session-based authentication. So let's move to the code and let me show you how to authenticate users using session-based authentication. In our example app, we have the user model that ships with every fresh Laravel installation, and we have the migrations for the user table, and we have also created a seeder that creates two users in our database. One user is Mohammed and the other user is James. One user has the email Mohammed@Laravel and password secret, and James has james@laravel.com as an email and password as passcode. We're going to head to the terminal and run the sail arts and migrate command to migrate our database, and we'll also use the seed option to seed it with the two users. So instead of having to call vendor bin sail, I alias this to just sail, which make it easier to type on a keyboard. So I'm just going to call sail arts and migrate and use the seed option. And now let's open a session with the database by using the sail MySQL command. And once we are in, we are going to run this query, select name, email, and password from users. And as we can see, the database has two users, Mohammed and James. Notice that the passwords are not stored in its original form inside the database. This is a hashed version of the password. Only our Laravel application can compare the plain string that the user provides with this hash and tell us if the string matches the hash. And that's how Laravel stores your password securely in the database. Now let's go back to PHP Storm and go to the web.php routes file. And we can see that we have three routes. One to show the form where the user can input their credentials, and another route to handle the form submission, and one to show the dashboard, which is the protected area we only want authenticated users to access. Let's go to the browser and visit localhost. And we can see that this view displays a form. If we go back to PHP Storm and check this view, we can see that the form has two fields, one for the email address and one for the password. The form action is pointing to the login route with the HTTP method post. Inside the view here, we also want to check the errors variable to see if there are any errors available to display to the user. We will use this to display validation errors after the form is submitted. Now let's go to the auth controller and handle the form submission inside the login controller method. We'll start by validating the user input by using the validator helper. We will pass the request data to this helper or to the first argument of the helper method. And for the second argument, we are going to provide the rules. We have two fields, the email, and the email field is required and it must be an email. And we also have the password field, and this field is also required. Finally, we are going to call the validate method to validate this input. And now we are ready to go. Let's go to the browser and try to submit the form without providing anything, and we can see that the errors returned says that the email field is required and the password field is required. So let's try to provide a wrong email address and click login, and we can see that the validation error now says the email must be a valid email address. Perfect. Now that we know that the validation works, let's attempt to authenticate the user. And to do that, we are going to use the auth helper. So let's open an if condition and call the auth helper. This helper returns an instance of Illuminate Contracts Auth Factory. And this interface has methods to authenticate users. We will use the attempt method. So it's attempt. And this method accepts an array of credentials. In our case here, the credentials are the email and password. So we are going to extract the email and password fields from the request. And to do that, we are going to call the request helper and call the only method and provide the email and password fields. The only method here will extract the email and password input from the request and pass it to the attempt method. The attempt method returns true if the credentials are correct and false otherwise. So if the credentials are correct, we want to redirect the user to the dashboard route. And to do that, we are going to return a redirect response and redirect the user to the dashboard route. And if the authentication fails, we want to redirect the user back to the login field or the login form. And with the redirect, we are going to attach errors using the with errors method. And we are going to attach a single error to the email field and say invalid credentials. And that should do. So now let's go to the browser and try to authenticate. So Mohammed at Laravel and provide the password at secret, hit login, and we can see that we can now access the dashboard route. The dashboard route has a simple view that returns the name of the user. If we check dashboard.plate.php, which is the view displayed inside the dashboard route, we can see that it uses the user variable and calls the name attribute on this variable. If we go to the dashboard controller, we can see that the user variable provided to the view is coming from calling the user method on the auth helper. This method here extracts the current logged in user to the Laravel application. And that's how the view learned that the current logged in user has the name of Mohammed Said. So behind the scenes, Laravel matched the credentials provided by the user with a record in our database, and it considered this user as the current logged in user. And it did that by storing the user ID inside the session data. And that's how it associated a session ID with a user ID from the database. To log a user out, Laravel does the opposite. It removes the user ID from the session data. So in future requests, when the browser sends a cookie with this session ID, Laravel will find that this session ID is not associated with any user in the database, and that means that this request is unauthenticated. Now let's implement a logout route. We'll go to the web.php routes file and add a new route here using the get HTTP method, and we'll call it logout. And then it will call a logout method on the auth controller. So let's go to the auth controller and create a new method called logout. This method will also use the auth helper and call the logout method on the auth helper. This will remove the current user ID that's stored in the session from the session data. And after logging the user out, we will want to redirect them back to the root of our application, which is the login form. So now let's go to the dashboard route and refresh just to make sure that we are authenticated, and we are. And if we visit the logout route, we are now logged out. If we go back and try to visit the dashboard route, we will see an exception. The exception says attempt to read property name on null. And this exception is coming from the dashboard controller, because now the user is logged out, auth user will return null, and inside the dashboard view, we are attempting to call the name parameter on null, which is why we get this exception. But this exception here means that the route was executed, the route controller method was executed, even though the user is not logged in. And that's not something we want. We want the Laravel application to completely ignore the controller method and never call it if the user is not logged in. And to do that, we are going to use the auth middleware. You can think of middleware as code that wraps your routes. You can run code inside the middleware before executing any route, and you can run code inside the middleware after executing any route. Let me show you. We will go to the web.php routes file, and we are going to protect the dashboard route by wrapping it inside the auth middleware. And to do that, we are going to call the middleware method in the route definition and pass the auth middleware. This middleware will check if there is an authenticated user, and if so, it will execute the route action normally. Otherwise, it will redirect to a route named login. For this to work, we need to give the route that shows the login form the name of login, so that this middleware can redirect to it. And to do that, we are going to go to the root route here, which shows the form, and we are going to give it a name, and we will call it login. Now let's go back to the browser and visit the dashboard route, and we can see that we were redirected back to the login form. The dashboard route was not executed. So since you have the auth middleware implemented on this route, this controller method was never executed. So if you have any code here that runs actions that you don't want any unauthenticated users to run, you are now safe, because this route controller method will never be executed. So that's it. Today we have learned about session-based authentication. In the next video, we are going to look into how to implement the Remember Me functionality. You know, this little checkbox that shows on every login form that you can check and ask the web application to keep you logged in for a long time without having to ask you to log in each time you visit the website. We are going to implement that. We are also going to look at token-based authentication in Laravel and explore our very first-party Laravel package, which is called Laravel Sanctum. So see you then.